hi, how are you? Welcome on in.
Podcast by George.
Another podcast by George.
Podcast by George. Border to border. Coast to coast. Podcast by George.
Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome on in to another podcast by George. Well, we've eclipsed the episode 500 mark. I think this is 501, maybe 502. 500 and some episodes of podcast by George. And as I explained earlier, a lot of reasons I started the show, but one of them was I wanted to continue to shed light on some major news from my lifetime. And that's what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be talking about the disappearance, the vanishing of Jodi Huisentruit 27 some years ago. And she's still gone, and she was going into a station in the early morning hours at age 27, you know, just like I used to do. Nobody was going to abduct me or run off with me. They would have thrown me back like a fish they didn't want, probably. But somebody took her. Some animal grabbed Jodi Huisentruit in a Mason City, Iowa parking lot to her apartment house and prevented her from going to work. And I knew 27-year-old women at stations going in early in the morning back in the day. So this shout out to Lori McManus if she's watching this morning. I mean, that would be just one example. So this really strikes home with me, and it's why we're doing it. And it's episode 501 or 502 or whatever it is. And we're going to be talking to this guy, folks. It's Scott Fuller. Now, Scott spent more than 15 years as head of programming for terrestrial radio stations all around the country, Maine, Wyoming, Minnesota. And he began podcasting in 2003. In recent years, he's conducted in-depth investigations of high-profile cold cases in several states through various ongoing podcast projects, including the 1995 disappearance of Mason City TV anchor Jodi Huisentruit, only 27 years old at the time. He joined FindJodi.com in January 2020. And I featured her case on Podcast by George, and I'm helping spread the word in a plea for someone to come forward after all these years. So let's click a button here, get that off the screen, and say good morning to our good buddy, our good pal, and that would be Scott Fuller. Hi, Scott.
Good morning, George. Thank you for having me back.
Yeah, thanks for coming on here. And thanks for all that you do and FindJodi.com, and the fact that you guys are still carrying the flag here, that you're not giving up on this. And I've got some people that are joining in. You know, every time we do a show, I have people email me and they say, what about this? What about that? Did you ask him about this? Well, hell, I'm not, I didn't think about that. But Scott knows. So I'm encouraging people, you got questions, you got comments, ask him while we've got him on this morning. And by way of introduction, I'm going to bring this up just to lay a little bit of the groundwork and to get Scott going. This was an article not that long ago in the Des Moines Register, kind of a retrospective on Jodi's case. And it reads, who was Jodi Huisentruit? Jodi Huisentruit, who was 27 years old at the time of her disappearance, was a Minnesota native who graduated from St. Cloud State University. Now, this highlighting is mine, Scott, and I want you to comment on this. She was an avid skier and moved to Mason City to become the morning and noon anchorwoman 2 years before her disappearance. Now, I want to underline there's nothing definitive in her case. Nobody knows anything for sure, but I highlighted this particular item, Scott, because this was important to me looking at this, because I've worked in this business, you still do, and you know, for what Jodi was doing in that size market at her age, 2 years was about the time to max out. I would think she was about ready to move on to bigger and better things. Now, I know that, you know that, and I wonder if whoever is responsible for this dastardly, deadly deed might have known that also, and that might have played a role in this. I would assume that angle's been well investigated.
Not as investigated as you might think, George, but that is a great point. Jodi arrived in Mason City from Alexandria, Minnesota in October of 1993 is when she moved to Mason City. She took the job as the daybreak, 5 a.m. Actually, I think it was 4:30. No, the show was 5 to 6 every Monday through Friday for KAMT. She had been there for 2 years, almost 2 years then, when she disappeared in June of 1995. I know for sure she was in talks with stations in Minneapolis, stations in the South where the weather is warmer. Her contract, I believe, would have been up at about that 2-year time coming up in October then. And Jodi was not going to stay in Mason City, Iowa for the rest of her career. That's the nature of media. I think she loved that job. I think she had a great connection with the audience, but she wanted to move up, or she wanted to move someplace where her outdoors active lifestyle was sort of more conducive. Where I think it's a good point that you raise is if Jodi's abductor was somebody that she knew, that might be some kind of acceleration of the abduction, possibly. We don't know who was responsible for Jodi's disappearance, but if there is a relationship there that this person sees going away because Jodi's going to go away, that could factor into the abduction. That's a good point.
Exactly. I know it from personal experience. I had a young woman, a girl that I really liked in college, and I knew as we approached graduation, she was from Chicagoland. She was leaving. I mean, she wasn't going to stay in Des Moines. She was going to be gone forever, and I remember feeling bad about that. So I was aware of that benevolently, but this person may have had ulterior, deadly motives. Let me bring this back up on screen and continue with this article because I want to get Scott's react on some of these things here. So read on. It says the morning of her disappearance, Huisentruit answered a call from KIMT TV, the producer. She said she'd overslept and was going to head into the office. The producer called again at 5 a.m. with no response before coworkers requested police to perform a welfare check at her apartment. Okay, again, all this highlighting his mind, Scott. But this wasn't just a producer at the station. This was a friend, right? This was somebody that knew Jodi personally. And my understanding is they don't believe that there was any reason, they didn't believe any reason to be concerned or alarmed based on that call. Now, my take on this would be women who are friends, they know each other. They kind of look out for each other. Their radar is kind of up. When Jodi called in early in the morning, the producer didn't think anything was up. So number one, do you believe that? And number two, if they truly didn't believe anything was up, maybe nothing was up at the time of that phone call. What do you think?
Yeah, the woman in the studio, Jodi's producer who called the police that morning was Amy Coons. And Amy had been Jodi's producer for some of her 2 years or 18 months at the Daybreak show. Jodi had been late previously on occasion. Amy had to pick up the phone and give her a call at the apartment, and Jodi would answer. She overslept occasionally. Jodi would come in. Amy would, in a sense, kind of cover for Jodi being late every now and again. It wasn't something that happened very often, but Amy said it did happen. The two of them were social. I wouldn't describe them, and Amy doesn't now, as having been friends necessarily, but they were amicable coworkers. They got along. They hung out occasionally at work functions, or after work, you go to the bar or something like that. I don't think they were very close. But I would invite everybody to put yourself in Amy's situation that morning. And we're getting to like 4 o'clock in the morning where Jodi is now a half hour plus late for her usual call time at 3 or 3:30 at the latest. And Amy is busy doing her tasks. And there are some pre-show tasks that Jodi has to accomplish as well. Amy now has to accomplish those. And time just sort of goes by. Amy's in get the show on the air mode, first and foremost. And all of a sudden, Amy realizes that about 5 o'clock, we're almost to air and Jodi is not here. And this has never happened before. Someone has to go on the air. So Amy goes on the air in Jodi's place. At some point during that broadcast, when Jodi's not there, following the broadcast at about 7 o'clock in the morning, Amy's like, I don't know what's going on, but this is bad. So they called the police just to go check on Jodi and see what might possibly be the explanation for this unprecedented event for Jodi. She had never missed air. She'd been late, but not that late.
Yeah, the show's got to go on, maybe fortunately or unfortunately, and that played a role in this. That highlighting there in the last sentence was also mine, and it was along the lines of exactly what you're talking about. I mean, Jodi might be late. She might come in right before air. She might even walk in during the show if something was really amiss. I'm thinking as the producer might think now. But 7 o'clock in the morning in Mason City, this ain't happening. Something is seriously wrong, and that's why they picked up the phone. I can understand that. Yeah, back in the day, you might think, well, weather. No, it wasn't weather. You might, well, her car breakdown. No, but even if those things did happen, it wouldn't result in this amount of time. So,
Right.
I certainly get that. Okay, I'm bringing this up on screen because let's talk about the evidence. And I had a question before I went on air
Sure.
from a viewer that I want to ask you about. But not a lot of evidence, but there was some evidence. Tell us what we're looking at here.
That is one of Jodi's shoes that was lost in the struggle with her abductor. I'm assuming, I don't know this for sure, I'm assuming that that shoe was something that Jodi would have worn during the day on the air, but not necessarily as she's rushing out of her apartment to go to work.
Mm.
So it's not unusual for anchors to have a bag, of a sort of on-air bag full of a blow dryer, makeup, and probably your less comfortable high heel shoes. So I'm not sure if Jodi was wearing the shoe that you see in that photo or not, or if it just fell out of her bag in the struggle. But that is what that picture shows, is Jodi's shoe next to her car. You can see the rain-soaked parking lot from the couple of days of rain they had from the days before. And there is a line of evidence then that goes sort of around the corner of that photo down a median. And that's the only physical evidence that was found in Jodi's case in terms of her possessions. The only thing of Jodi's that's ever been found was found on that day in that parking lot.
My God, and what I think when I look at that is some animal. I mean, my God, something came out of the dark
Mm.
and grabbed her, and either her shoe was on her foot or it was in a bag or whatever. And my God, this is what is left behind. People need to be aware this kind of evil is out there, man. It's creeping around. It always has, and it always will. I mean, okay, so tell us what this is.
That's the key to Jodi's Mazda Miata that was found next to her vehicle as well. It's difficult to tell in that picture, but the key is slightly bent. So in Jodi's case, people refer to the key being bent, and you might imagine that's in like a 90-degree angle. It's not. I mean, it's a sturdy car key, but that key is bent, and the presumption is the reason for that is Jodi had walked to her car, inserted that key into the driver's side door lock, and then the force of her being attacked from behind bent the key inside the lock slightly. It fell out of the lock. That's also when her driver's side rear view mirror was bent forward. So it's a pretty safe assumption that Jodi never saw her attacker before it happened, that this person came up to her from behind as she's rushing out the door, late for work. Obviously, being attacked at that particular moment is not something that's on Jodi's mind. Last thing she's thinking about, and this person had the element of surprise. But that's the key to Jodi's Miata, which she bought just a few weeks earlier.
Yeah, little things can mean everything. And
Mhm.
just listening to you describe the key, in my mind, somebody that was known to her, somebody that might have been trusted, a friend or something like that, somebody that was heartbroken over her leaving the Mason City television market, as an example, what we started off talking about. Would they run up and grab her with this kind of force from behind unannounced? Or would this be some kind of an assailant that was unknown and invisible to her and didn't want to be seen until the final deed was done? Okay, let me bring that off screen and ask you about this, Scott, because this was the viewer's question. A lot of these cold cases, I know you've looked at a lot of them. I mean, some of them do get solved.
Mhm.
And, not very often deathbed confessions, not very often anybody admitting what they did. A lot of times it's forensics, it's DNA that they're finding. So the question from the viewer was, any DNA evidence in this that's known, or is there a possibility that it's just under seal and that there actually is some?
I guess that is possible. There's no known DNA evidence in Jodi's case. We don't know what items they have. We don't know what state that they're in from inside or outside of the apartment. The car was returned to the family pretty quickly afterwards. It was processed and then returned, but we don't know what kind of lifts or evidence they have from inside the car still. The advancement in DNA technology over the years is the only thing that makes me hesitate. Maybe they have something that some kind of future technology will be able to manifest into evidence that could point to somebody. But what's known is at least one palm print was found at the scene and one single hair. And when it comes to physical evidence in Jodi's case, That's it. There was a palm print. The palm print may or may not be from the abductor. It could be from anybody who was in contact with Jodi's car over the last, it had rained, so let's say the last 12 or 24 hours. And the hair, it's a public parking lot of an apartment complex, so that hair could come from anybody. Police do have Jodi's DNA on file, so if they ever find any remains or anything that might otherwise be linked to her, that will help identify her. But this palm print apparently has never been matched to anybody so far as we know, and we're not, again, even sure if it's involved. So George's problem in this case is we have a lack of physical evidence, we have a lack of forensic evidence, and we don't have a body. And those things all together make cases very difficult to prosecute.
Okay, and I've got some questions coming in from folks, and again, a lot of this stuff I'm not aware of. I don't know anything about, so I'm very cautious about posing these questions on air
That's it.
because I don't want to say something negative about somebody that doesn't have any connection. Do you know anything about a potential suspect named Dirk? First name Dirk. Do you know what this person is referring to?
I believe they're referring to a gentleman who was a city employee for Mason City, Iowa.
Has he been cleared? Do you know?
He has not been by the police. He hasn't been ruled in or ruled out. And just like any closed investigation, we're not sure what the police have looked into. They have formally cleared a few people, but they've, especially in recent years, the Mason City Police has closed this file up pretty good just to preserve whatever that they do have and make it guilty knowledge in the future or prosecutable in the future.
Okay, so before I forget to ask you now, my understanding is, having looked into this a little bit, the Mason City investigators will tell you, yeah, we got stuff that nobody knows but us. And we want to keep it that way because this will help us catch whoever's responsible. If we find out at some point that somebody knows what only we know, we got them. Is that a reality?
I'm not sure what they have, obviously, but yeah, that's what law enforcement may refer to as guilty knowledge. This is something only the person that committed the crime or was involved in the commission of the crime would know. That is absolutely essential to keep close to the investigation. My hope is that's the case, that they do have a couple of things that we have never heard about and have never been made public. They've made the palm print public, they made the hair public over the years. So I'm doubtful, but I'm optimistic about that. The worst case scenario, honestly, is that we know everything they do. That would not be good for a prosecution of the case.
Okay, let me bring this back up on screen because I've got a question from a viewer about this, and you can answer this. This is from Christine. She wants to know why the car key was not on a ring
Yes.
with additional keys. Well, yeah, it was a fairly new car. Is that she really loved this thing. Is there a possibility she just didn't want to put it on a key ring and hadn't done it yet because it was new, or is there something more here?
That's a great question, Christine. I don't know the answer. What you just posited, George, is a possibility. My personal theory, and this is just, I have no backing for this, but if you rent a car, George, you're given the key on a very thin ring. Have you ever noticed that, where it's not as thick as the rest of the ring with your house keys on it, let's say? I have a suspicion that key used to be attached to a very thin metal ring that was then attached. That ring was attached to a bigger ring. And during the struggle, given the force that bent the mirror and the key, that ring would have been ripped right off. It doesn't make sense for me for her, even after a couple of weeks, not to have that key on a ring. So I'm thinking it was double ringed. It was ringed with a thinner ring that she probably got from the dealership, the person that she bought the car from. And then that was just ejected. That was torn off in the struggle. That's my guess. That's a great point.
All right, let me get back to the article here because I want to bring up more of this as we move along. We can get some more questions. And CBS's 48 Hours featured the case in December 2018, revealing new details of the case and footage, including police interviews with John Van Cise, a friend of Huisentruit, who is believed to be the last person to have seen her before she vanished. In March 2018, Mason City Police executed search warrants for cars belonging to him. Now, he's 20 years older than Huisentruit and may have had an infatuation with her. And he was definitely, at the very least, a very good friend. Jim Axelrod, who hosted 48 Hours, went to Van Cise's Arizona home to get a comment about the case, but Van Cise gruffly declined. Okay, and I can understand that, actually, why somebody if they were innocent or guilty, would do that. What about these search warrants? I know this raised your eyebrows. Is this still an ongoing issue, or has this been resolved? Why did they issue search warrants for this guy's cars, particularly since they weren't cars that were involved back in 96 or 95, whenever it was? Yeah.
The probable cause affidavit, so the application that the police have to give to a judge to say, we have reason to believe that this person is involved or has knowledge of a crime that has been committed or will be committed. That's what the law enforcement has to give to a judge. That has remained sealed ever since the application for the warrant. So that's not necessarily uncommon. It's not necessarily indication of a cover-up on anyone's part. The probable cause affidavit attached to that search warrant is what police have to give the judge to say, here's some of the evidence we have. And if some of that evidence that they have is some of that guilty knowledge evidence or something that the investigators don't want out into the public for whatever reason, they can ask for a seal on that warrant. Judge will typically, some would argue too often in just across the country, grant that seal. And so it's probably never going to be unsealed. So we don't have answers to the questions of the evidence the police have that led them to Van Cise vis-a-vis that warrant. And we probably never will. We might if the case were closed, but that's probably going to be that way in Iowa. That's the way it is for a while now.
And again, I looked at that and I thought, well, they didn't issue search warrants for anybody else's car. They weren't interested in anybody else's car. So this tells me, at least in their mind anyway, that Van Cise is still in play, so to speak, that he is still of interest, as they say.
I can tell you, George, I'm not sure how many people realize this. Obviously, people know about John Van Cise. He's been mentioned in Jodi's case a lot from day one. John Van Cise arrived at Jodi's apartment while police were just gathering themselves. They were trying to figure out what's going on here. John pulled up in a pickup truck with two other men and basically very agitatedly, according to reports, said, I was the last person to see Jodi or something along those lines. Not sure word for word if that's what he said, but he did indicate to them that he had a videotape that he and Jodi had watched at his house the night before. Police said, yeah, go get that and meet us down at the station. He did. In media interviews within 48 hours of June 27th, John is giving a timeline to the question, when did Jodi leave your apartment, your townhouse? John says about 8:30. That's what he tells the press. I have no idea what he told police, but within 2 days, he's telling the media about 8:30, 9 o'clock. She left his apartment. Well, police now, we know, have phone records from inside Jodi's apartment. She makes a landline phone call at 8:24 p.m. She left the golf tournament event that she was at 8 p.m. So we have Jodi leaving at 8 o'clock, phone call with her in her apartment at 8:24. John says in media interviews that she left his place at about 8:30. That's obviously a tight timeline. That doesn't work. We don't know what time Jodi actually left his apartment. We don't know if he's just spitballing in front of TV cameras when he gives that timeline. But you can understand, given that information, why from day one he's been looked at so hard over the years. Just that basic 8 to 9 o'clock timeline.
Wow. And I think about that dude, and I think about these young women moving around in these television markets, as I mentioned, going to college and all that type of thing. You know, a lot of times they want to have somebody that's a local that can help with local things. That's a friend. I mean, it could be benevolent. Who knows? I mean, they certainly don't know, or he wouldn't be out walking around. Okay, I want to get to the rest of this, but I want to bring up a couple of just to go through these. I want to show people, the beautiful Jodi Huisentruit here, and one of the reasons that she was so adored, and the reason that she was moving up in markets. These are some photos that people have seen. This particular photo, I wanted to ask you about because I've got a different take on this that I haven't seen or heard anybody else express. This is her 27th birthday party. Again, this strikes me because in numerology, the number 27, particularly for birthdays for people that know rock music, like the Hendrix, Jim Morrison, Janis Joplin, 27 years old. That's when, of course, it wasn't a circumstance like this, but that's when they pass away. Okay, so here's Jodi's 27th birthday. Scott, I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, and I remember this era in particular. And this is a beautiful young woman. She's beautiful here, but she's dressed extremely conservatively. If you look at this, this is not a big celebration looking birthday coming out kind of a party outfit. I look at this and I think to myself, and this is what you can get into thinking things. She's trying to keep somebody from getting any ideas, maybe somebody at this party. Have you ever heard anything like that? 'Cause I'm looking at this thinking, man, that's a pretty conservative outfit for your 27th birthday party celebration.
I don't know. I guess that's open to interpretation. I just view when I see that photo, it looks like a lot of her photos. She dressed well. She dressed very, especially compared to today, she dressed very conservatively. That birthday party was a couple of weeks before her disappearance. It was thrown or organized by John Van Sice, who we mentioned already, and a couple of his friends at a bar in the Mason City area. And she, by all accounts, had a great time, and there was nothing necessarily unusual about the birthday party itself. I think it gets roped into the case because of John's mentioning it at the scene on that morning that the two of them had watched that videotape together. But yeah, I mean, she had fun. She was professional. There are a lot of times I see video of Jodi just out in public and public events that it seems to me like she's aware that people are going to be looking at her because she's on television. And I think she enjoyed that attention that she, one of the things she liked about being on television was interacting personally with the community outside of the broadcast studio. So I guess in terms of how she dresses, I've never thought too much about it in terms of provocation or anything like that. I've always seen her as very conscious of her accessories and her clothing and presenting herself very well, but not necessarily anything beyond that.
Yeah, and this was 95 or 96. I'm not real good at math, but yeah. Okay, so let me. I want because we're going to lose us, and we could go all day on this stuff because there's a lot of different angles on this. Let me see what we continue with. Okay, so here's according to ABC, Gone at Dawn features the first national TV interview with this Tony Jackson guy. Now this is jaw dropping. I mean, it's hard to believe. Jackson, who's serving prison time for a string of Minnesota rapes during the 1990s, was also featured during the 48 Hours special. He was living in Mason City when Huisentruit disappeared. There's a lot of coincidences in life. And in these cold cases, they abound. And this case is no exception. But this right now is kind of stymied. This isn't a dead end necessarily, as I take it, Scott, but this one's not moving ahead, right?
I mean, Tony Jackson's been asked several times by law enforcement, by reporters, national television, did you have anything to do with Jodi Huisentruit? He's always denied that he had anything to do with Jodi's disappearance. We know for a fact through science, through DNA, what he did in the Twin Cities metro area just a couple of years later. But 2 years before that, in 95, he is living in Mason City at the time that Jodi disappeared. He is, I believe, my opinion is he's capable of committing that crime just based on what we know about what he did later. He has to be there. He has to be in the parking lot in order to make that connection. And there's nothing to put him there, and he has never put himself there. So it's just one more that you can hang on the rack of, yes, it's possible. He's not been eliminated as far as I'm concerned. The police did come out and say that we're no longer investigating him because we conducted interviews and various other things. When the Minneapolis media started looking into it, Mason City did look into it, the police, and they ruled him out. I'm not sure based on what, but I'm not ruling him in either, because in order to do this, he has to be there at that time, regardless of what he does 2 years later. So he's still kind of out there, just like so much in this case.
Now, there's one thing that you brought out on an earlier broadcast that I recall, and that is if you wanted to locate Jodi and where she lived, you didn't have to be a super sleuth, right? I mean, anybody could figure out where she was at. Is that true?
Yeah, she was in the phone book. Her apartment's address, her unit number, her home telephone number, her landline inside the apartment were in the phone book, which is just, it's hard to relate to today at all, but it's unconscionable for a public figure, you would think. I was shocked to find that in the archives several years ago now. But also the car, George. If you had been following her movements or tracking her around town for any period of time, she has gone from a much more bland sedan to a bright red, top-down convertible. In Mason City, Iowa, as you know, there are tons of white pickup trucks. There are not many top-down red, cherry red Mazda Miata convertibles. So even just tracking her as you drove around town, not necessarily following her, but you could see her car at the grocery store. There's Jodi. You could see her car at a restaurant and pretty much know where she was. Definitely could see that car in its usual space in the Key apartment parking lot as well.
Okay, here's the final slide here. I wanted to bring this up because it shows the billboard that you folks are behind, and the highlighting here again is mine. This is the theme moving forward, folks. Somebody knows something, and all we want is somebody to come forward with something. And the billboards, are they still up, Scott?
They are. One of them is, yes.
Yeah. So, and I want to encourage everybody, of course, to go to findjodi.com and check it out. And before we move on here, I actually can bring this up on screen. Let me see here. Okay, let me share this. I'll bring this up on. Now, this is the findjodi.com. And I talked earlier about Scott and his role and what all these volunteers and people are doing. Talk about this guy, Scott.
That's Gary Peterson. He recently passed away. Gary was a news director at KAL TV in Austin, Minnesota, where he worked with Josh Benson. And together they co-founded findjodi.com way back, I mean, in the early days of the internet, just as sort of a place to further investigate the case. There was a message board. It's evolved over the years now into much more locked up journalistic research and just being a lighthouse for Jodi's case. Gary looked into Jodi's case for I don't know how many years, but I've talked to him for hours about everything he's done before his passing for Jodi's case. And right up until the end, he was looking at Jodi's case just about every day, going through all the old files. He was an old bulldog. He was actually a certified death scene investigator. He investigated some high-profile cases across the country as well. He was a remarkable guy, and it was very sad to see his passing. That was just a couple of weeks ago here.
Yeah, and I want to encourage everybody to go to findjodi.com and peruse the site a little bit. Look at the headers here, and I'll click what might be the most important one. This is the contact page. There's a number of ways to get in touch, and I know you say this all the time, Scott, but if anybody's got an idea, anybody's got a clue, anybody's got something that they think nobody else would be interested in, share it, right?
That's my line. You got it down, George. Yep. That's even if you think you're bothering us, even if you've given it to us or police or anybody else before, and you feel it was never followed up on, if it's a theory you have, if it's a thought you have, we get all kinds of emails. Some are names and dates and locations, George, and some are, I had a dream about Jodi last night. Well, you can take those with a grain of salt or not, but I read every one of them because sometimes I think of psychic tips the same way. I'm not necessarily a believer in, say, a psychic ability to divine anything, but I'm also not so arrogant that I'm going to say it's impossible. And more importantly, those can get you thinking about things a little bit different based on information that you already have and turn the hourglass upside down a little bit. So please reach out. Any information that you can share with us. We also encourage people to share with MCPD and the Iowa DCI. But it's going to be, George, without body, without any physical evidence, very limited for forensic evidence to speak of. At this point, it's going to be somebody coming forward and telling a story that they saw or telling a story that they heard about from 10 years ago or 27 years ago. And that I think is the best hope for an answer for Jodi and the community of Mason City and Jodi's friends and family.
Okay, so you mentioned an interesting angle there, and I know I have viewers that are interested in this. The psychic, it's been tried. I mean, everything that can be tried has been tried, correct? I'm not a big believer in psychics either, and I'm reminded of the amazing Randy that used to have like $1 million reward for anybody that could connect the dots that way. His point was, a psychic always start off by telling you, for instance, well, the body's near
near water.
Near water. Well, hell,
Near water.
water's everywhere. I mean, yeah.
Right. So and listen, I'm aware, just to play devil's advocate on myself, I'm aware of a handful of 6, 7 cases where psychics have contacted law enforcement and given information that was fairly specific, and it turned out to be dead on accurate. I don't know what's out there in the universe. I don't know. I don't claim to know what people's untapped mental abilities are, but I'm a bit of a cynic when it comes to psychics, George, because I've seen over the years in these cases family members who are so desperate for answers, and psychics are among the first to latch onto that and really do and say terrible things to these family members, knowing full well that they have no information in the case, that they can't help these family members. That is a reprehensible phenomenon, but it does happen. There are all kinds of people out there. But when it comes to psychics reaching out to police, I always say, hear them out. You never know, A, are they divine? Do they have this divination, this ability? B, they may have information that they don't want to put forward in a straightforward way. Like they don't want to come forward and say, I saw this, or maybe I was somewhat involved in this. So they might say, I have this vision. That's important for law enforcement, and also just to look at things again from a different standpoint. So I'm very interested in all the paranormal phenomenon, some of which you talk about here on your show, but it gets real for me when these people are contacting family members of missing children or missing people or murdered people, and claiming that they can help, knowing full well that they can't. So
I kind of look at it. Maybe they're educated guessing, but they're guessing. But if they guess right, I mean, that's the other thing. I mean, we'll take it. I mean, that's the way you got to look at it. Well, let me bring this up on screen to see what, if anything, you know about this. I wanted to circle back on this. Jodi Huisentruit went missing in 1995. A friend hopes a $25,000 reward uncovers her remains. Nearly 28 years after Jodi Huisentruit's disappearance, a $25,000 reward is being offered for information that leads to the recovery of the remains of the former Mason City morning television news anchor, according to a news release. Now, this was a news release that prompted this writing in the Des Moines Register. As we mentioned, Huisentruit disappeared early on the morning of June 27th, 1995, on her way to work at KIMT TV in Mason City. Though the case has remained in the public eye, no arrest or charges have been made in connection to the case. Now, licensed private investigator Steve Ridge offered the reward as a private citizen. Ridge said the reward offer has the blessing of Huisentruit's sister, Joanne Nath. I speak with Joanne on a regular basis, and we've decided the timing is right to seek information on where Jodi's body was discarded. Ridge said this reward does not require an arrest or conviction, but simply the recovery of Jodi's remains. Ridge added, the fear that Jodi Huisentruit's abduction stirs is widely shared. A 1995 Des Moines Register article said women's vulnerability to crime is well understood, though not talked about much, perhaps because it's a fact of life. Again, this was back in 95 when this was written. True then, true today. However, abhorred, and because it's usually harassment or robbery or rape, but not a disappearance into thin air. Well, that pretty much covers that, Scott. Anybody that has information, there's a number of ways to give a tip, and find Jodi.com and Crime Stoppers and places like that. But here's a guy that says he's got $25,000 if somebody wants to forward info. Let me see if I can what happened to my audio here?
I muted myself, George.
Oh, there you go. Okay,
I hit a button.
that's all right.
The reward. I don't know anything about the money, where the money is connected to. I hesitate to speak about the reward because it's not done through. I think the most effective way to do something like this is through Crime Stoppers, just because it's more organized on the law enforcement side. No matter what we do in advancing Jodi's case, and we're conscious of this at Find Jodi all the time, if we uncover something and in some way it makes the case unprosecutable, and so in some way the chain of custody is disturbed, or in some way evidence can be ruled inadmissible in the future, that is not something that we want to come close to doing. So while we don't work with law enforcement, we certainly don't want to do anything that is going to potentially hinder or complicate a future prosecution, regardless of what we do. So this is not money that we're offering, and I'm not aware of its origin or the requirements for claiming any such reward. So I kind of want to hesitate to go there. But just to generally say that the most important thing as we advocate for the case is to make sure that we don't do anything to screw it up in the meantime. And so we're very cautious of that and very careful about that, that whatever we do uncover at Find Jodi is going to be something that is helpful in the end, not just for us being able to say that we did something or solve the case.
Yeah, and again, we're running out of time here. And Scott, if you get into a time crunch, just let us
No,
know.
feel free. I
Yeah,
got time.
okay. Because I got some questions coming in from folks, and I wanted to get to one of the more conspiratorial angles on this thing. We talked about John Van Cise. He's been looked at extensively. There's one thing that I was surprised to find out about. He's got an alibi I don't know if it's airtight or not, but he's got somebody that was with him at the time or very shortly thereafter when the crime was committed. That's kind of an alibi for him. Isn't that true?
A woman named LaDonna Woodford has told me, and she's told now a national television audience, she appeared on 48 Hours several years ago, that she was walking with John Van Cise um, early in the morning following Jodi's abduction. So it's not a complete alibi, but she does say that after 6 o'clock in the morning, she took a long walk with John around Mason City. She and I down there drove the walking path. She showed me exactly where they walked that morning and what time. And as we were walking, she's trying to reenact the conversation that they had. So it doesn't fully alibi John Van Cise. It would complicate things for him to be involved in the case if we know the abduction occurs at about 4:15 or 4:20 in the morning. If by 6 o'clock he is home to receive this landline phone call that LaDonna Woodford says that she placed, there's an hour and a half to do whatever needs to happen in the interim with the commission of the crime and eventually the hiding of the body in such a way where it's never been found. So it's an important point on the timeline that I do have to point out has never been disproven. LaDonna's story has never been is credible in terms of what is verifiable now with the evidence.
And you've talked to a lot of people. I mean, you're an investigator, and yeah, I know LaDonna. Any possibility in your mind that she might have been confused on timing, on days, that type of thing? Did your spidey sense go off? Did you get a tingle at all when you were talking to her that she might not be on it as far as days and times are concerned, that type of thing?
So I think we have to be careful with that in terms of unconscious bias, where it leads us as we're journalists or we're investigators. What I need is something I can go back and somehow verify. So whether or not I think a person is telling the truth, whether or not I think, another example is if a person goes missing and a husband goes on television and makes an emotional plea video, immediately you'll see the reaction of that guy did it. I can tell. I'm looking at it. Look, he did it. You can't do
Yeah.
that. It has to be verifiable. It has to be fact based. With LaDonna's story, and I'll be honest, I've tried to disprove her story, and I can't. I haven't been able to.
Mm.
And LaDonna told us that she had testified in front of a grand jury. If her testimony is the same as she's given to us, then she's opening herself up to prosecution if police can prove that she had lied about that under oath to the grand jury. That has not happened. Nobody has been able to disprove LaDonna's story. So you can't rule it out. You can't just write off a piece of information because it's inconvenient for what your theory might be.
That's great information. Okay, let me bring this up on screen because this gets in kind of a quick hitter here. We don't have a lot of time here, but could an Iowa man's mysterious death be connected to the disappearance of news anchor Jodi Huisentruit? And I read this and what? Billy Pruin was found dead from a gunshot wound just 3 months before his friend and popular news anchor Jodi Huisentruit was abducted on her way to work. I mean, you see this and your eyes pop out of your head. And it says, Beth Picard, retired television anchor and author of Dead Air, The Disappearance of Jodi Huisentruit, claimed there was some very unusual circumstances surrounding this Pruin's death, including the fact that there was no gunshot wound on his body. A well-known farmer in the area, Pruin had been vocal about Mason City's growing methamphetamine problem, which could have upset local drug traffickers. I'm reading this. Oh, what the hell? Perhaps it was a drug operative that wanted to silence him. I think it was very possible Huisentruit was looking into Pruin's death. maybe she was asking too many questions. Okay, I don't need to go on with this, but I talk about media literacy and looking closely at every word and every story on news stories of the day. Scott, there's a lot of maybes. There's a lot of possibilities. There's a lot of things here that are kind of open ended. If I understand correctly, this is somebody that apparently was known to Jodi Huisentruit that committed suicide sometime before she died. And now this person's going back and trying to say that maybe Jodi knew something about some nefarious activity that this dead person was involved with in, and then she was silenced because of that knowledge that she had through her reporting or investigations. I look at that and I think, oh man, I don't know. And the other thing about it is just based on being the morning television news host, being 27 years old, getting into this business, doing the kind of stuff that she was doing. I'm thinking, this sounds like a conspiracy to me. Has this been looked at, Scott?
Yes, I want to back you up one slide, George. I think you said there was no gunshot wound on his body. I think what Beth's book claims is there was no GSR, no gunshot.
Correct. I must have read that wrong. Yeah.
Body. So I'll briefly, as brief as I can, tell you this: the story of Billy Pruin. He was a friend of Jodi Huisentruit's. He was always also an acquaintance of John Van Cise in that circle of friends. He was found shot to death in his kitchen not long before Jodi's disappearance, and that timing, I think, is part of the reason why he gets looped in with Jodi's case. His death was ruled a suicide initially, and it has since been looked at enough where they changed the cause of death, I believe, to unclassified. I'm not sure, but I've seen the crime scene photos, the death scene photos of Billy Pruin in his kitchen. And while it's true what Beth says in the book that there is no GSR, no gunshot residue present on his hands, I'm not sure how extensive the testing was. That is unusual. That's an anomaly. Any firearm that you discharge, if you're holding the gun, there's a potential for GSR, especially when it comes to the gun that Billy was found next to Billy, which was a Ruger 44 Super Blackhawk, which is a single shot revolver. And so you have that revolving chamber, and you have the gap, I can't think of the technical term, but it's even more prevalent, is my point. The GSR with a 44 Ruger is even more prevalent than usual. So it is notable that there is no GSR found by the testing that was done. However, there is plenty more evidence to indicate that Billy's death was a self-inflicted accident. And the family hired a private investigator, which is how I got access to all the reports and the photographs from the scene. And there are a couple of things from that I'll briefly highlight that really jump out at me. Number one, Billy was shot in the chest, I believe the right chest. His entrance wound was 4 inches lower than the exit wound on his back, meaning he was shot from a slightly upward trajectory. The blood spatter that was found inside that kitchen was found on the floor in a 90-degree droplet. So a very basic blood spatter. If you see elongated, thin lines, that's indication of velocity or something that is bleeding or something that has blood on it, moving very quickly. If you see fat little drops, then you can discern that the blood source was directly above 90 degrees above where it was found. The spatter in the kitchen, there were a couple of blood drops in the kitchen. They were all 90-degree drops, indicating that the blood came from directly above. If Billy had been shot while standing, you would see more angular, more thin blood spatter, and it would have been behind him as he stood in the kitchen, or in front of him if he was shot from behind. But he was shot from the front, and the only spatter in the kitchen is on the kitchen floor. So he was hunched over as he was shot, and there is no spatter behind him. And the long and the short of Billy Pruin is my belief, based on the evidence, based on the file, is that he tripped and accidentally shot himself with a 44 caliber Super Blackhawk with a hair trigger, holding the gun essentially backwards as he fell forward. And the metal on his watch may or may not have pulled the trigger as he fell down and was shot. And there's also what was very interesting to me about Billy's case, there's a phenomenon called a cadaveric spasm, which sometimes is referred to the death grip. sometimes, not always, but sometimes in the very moment of a person passing away, your hands will grip as tightly as they can, sort of unconsciously. This is why sometimes you'll see drowning victims being pulled from water, clutching seaweed, for example. Billy's hands in the photos, you can see, have evidence of cadaveric spasm, but the gun is about 3.5 feet away from him on the kitchen floor. So had he been holding the gun in that situation, really the only time that a suicide victim has that gun still in their hand typically is when cadaveric spasm is present. Billy has that present in his hands, but the gun is 3.5, 4 feet away from him on the floor. So as crazy as that sounds, I have been convinced that that was incorrectly ruled a suicide, and I think it's been changed to undetermined since then. And the family's PI named Don Sasma did just amazing work on piecing all of that together. So you have the lack of GSR over here, but then you've got the cadaveric spasm, you've got the blood spatter, you've got everything else over here. And I think it's unfortunate because it was kind of a crazy thing. It was kind of a random happenstance event, but people are shot or people shoot themselves is the first place that we go to with gunshot wounds when we see or hear about them. There is a third option, and it happens all the time, every day, that accidental shootings do happen, even self-inflicted ones.
Yeah. And the two forms, the accidental and the self-inflicted, are much more likely to occur. Yeah, it was fascinating to hear you describe that. It reminds me, I've delved in and looked at the Kennedy assassination very closely. Same type of thing. There's absolutely one thing that's true when it comes to ballistics, and that is nothing is absolute. A lot of people looked at that and said, "Oh my God, he was shot. He had to be shot from the front because his head snapped back." And well, no, I mean, if you look at it, there's scientific explanations for what happened to Kennedy. I'm firmly convinced it was Oswald up there with a 6.5 millimeter Manley Carcano rifle taking pot shots. That's what killed Kennedy. And you can look at it any number of ways. One way that people have looked at that's very similar to what you're describing. This is a guy, this supposed suicide victim or accidental shooting victim, as you've described, was known to Van Cise and Jodi Huisentruit. You look at that and go, oh my God, there has to be something going on here with this triangle.
As Beth points out in her book, I have no trouble believing that after Billy's death and it's ruled a suicide, and rumor is it's suspicious, but the police can't figure out, or the coroner can't figure out exactly what's going on. I have no doubt that Jodi might have said to somebody needs to look into that. Jodi is a reporter. She's not an investigative reporter. She's not going to go looking into that. But if she ever made that comment to anybody, then it just gets rolled into the rumor. So you have her disappearance months after Billy Pruin's death. You have her talking about it, and you have methamphetamine. You have a drug problem in the Mason City area just generally, and it just becomes an easy explanation for that void in our understanding that we humans can't have. We have to know what happened, or at least we have to pacify ourselves with must have been drug related. There's that Billy Pruin thing. You tie it all together, but that's not the way you have to research these cases if you actually want to forward the case and find an answer eventually.
And I'll say this in closing with the Kennedy assassination. A lot of people look at people that died known to Oswald and the Kennedys and Connolly and Johnson and the CIA and stuff. Oh, look at this person died accidentally. This person committed suicide. This couldn't have happened. These people knew one another. Well, I mean, that's kind of humanity. That's kind of the way we are. Scott, if I were to fall over dead tomorrow under suspicious circumstances, you'd be able to look back in my past and find all kinds of people that have passed away accidentally via suicide, maybe, or under strange circumstances that people would be looking at in a conspiracy vein that are completely innocent and unrelated. It's kind of 6 degrees. It's just kind of human, I think, but that's a weird one. I gotta admit,
I firmly believe it, and I'm as cynical and skeptical when it comes to, especially outside of official rulings. I'm a police guy. I'm a coroner guy. If they say it, I'm going to believe it. It had to be proven to me almost against my will that Billy Pruin was probably walking across his kitchen with the 44 in his hand, probably to go shoot a rodent of some kind, that he tripped either on the wet floor, there's water in the crime scene photos as well, or tripped on just a little ledge that we all have, most of us have, from room to room, And as he fell forward, he grabbed first at his gun, and then the watch on his left hand, just that little metal, not sure what it's called, but that little metal piece pulled a hair trigger, which that 44 has, and he shot himself at that upward angle we were describing through the chest and out the back. The slug is in the ceiling, so it'd be a very strange murder scene anyway to shoot somebody from that low an angle from across the room to achieve that bullet trajectory as well. And I'm looking at all this evidence, and my mind is just blown. But you have to accept it. Like that stuff like this does happen. Crazy coincidences do happen in cases, and sometimes those coincidences prevent cases from being solved. But Don Sasma did amazing work on that Billy Pruin case.
God. Well, we're coming up here on the top of the hour, so I'm going to have to close out. And I'm going to bring the findjodi.com URL back on screen. And I mean, I find this stuff fascinating. I love talking to Scott because he's a pro. And I mean, I'm going to turn it over to you here, Scott. Give us a close, give us a wrap, and I'll put this up on screen.
Yeah, I would just remind people that Jodi Huisentruit has been missing for going on 28 years now. We're already planning for the anniversary event. We do a small commemoration of Jodi's life just to make sure that people hadn't forgotten about her, or the fact that the case is unsolved. Usually it's in front of the TV station in Mason City, Iowa, and it's May. I can't believe we're coming up on June 27th. Every year at that event, I say, I hope this is the last. And so far it has not been, but we're only that phone call, that tip, that story away from somebody coming forward to police and giving them that information. This person may be alive. This person, if they were Jodi's age, would only be 55 or 57 years old. This person could have been dead for 10 years. But if there's a way to prove for the family, just to give that answer for everybody, here is what happened and here's how we can prove it. And you have that bit of information, even if you don't have all the pieces together, if you can just plop that one missing piece in for us or for investigators at the police department, that would mean the world to more people than you know. So don't hesitate to come forward. A lot of times gone by, relationships change. The administration at the Mason City Police Department has changed. I've had people who have came forward to MCPD 20 years ago, 25 years ago, and they did not feel like they were heard or listened to. That's changed. The administration, at least, has changed. These are not the same investigators, obviously, as happened back then. Reach out to us. It's just going to be somebody saying something until something is found pertaining to Jodi's case evidentiarily. It's going to be somebody saying something that finally solves this case. And beyond all that important stuff, George, my wife would be eternally grateful if you would come forward, just so I can move on to something.
Well, and that reminds me again, thank for you and the gentleman that just passed on, everything that you guys are through the years. I mean, this takes forever, folks. It's a lot of hard work. And if you're interested in what we were talking about, what Scott was talking about, go to findjodi.com, and you can spend all day there. I mean, they've got they've got Scott's podcast, the videos, photographs, and that contact form. And then also that button that I could bring up on screen. You really want to support them. If you have the wherewithal to be able to do this, donate a little bit. I mean, throw a little bit of money to help them carry on this great work. Scott, thanks so much for coming on Podcast by George. Man, I really appreciate you and yours.
We always appreciate the exposure for Jodi's case. Thank you, George. And thanks to everybody who was watching or listening.
Okay, that's great, man. That's Scott Fuller, folks. Findjodi.com. And, go there. Right after you go there, go to podcastbygeorge.com and follow us, subscribe. I tell people all the time, you can do it very easily. The YouTube and Facebook icons are on podcastbygeorge.com. I mean, you just got to click those and you'll be able to subscribe to the videos, the live streams like we have them. And then, of course, if you just want to follow this was an hour long today. If you just want to listen to these while you're on your bike or in your car or something like that, that's easily done on the audio platforms. We're on iTunes, Spotify, the iHeartRadio app, Deezer, Stitcher, all of those, podcast platforms. And you can just get the audio if you don't have the ability to sit down and watch us on video for an hour at a shot. But folks, that's going to do it. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is. And there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.